Walter Payton, Michael Strahan, Jerry Rice, Doug Williams, Steve McNair, Shannon Sharpe. What do they all have in common? They all went to HBCUs, which is sort of incredible. JB, talk a little bit about how impactful HBCUs were and why they're not as impactful to the state of the NFL and procuring talent in the NFL as we see before.
Yeah, when you talk about the talent and the players you mentioned, I mean, you do an all HBCU team and it can beat any team out there. Let's say that. And obviously, when you had segregation, especially as football really took hold as a more prominent sport in this nation, and I'm talking about in the 40s and the 50s, and top players couldn't go to white schools. Well, they went to black schools and black colleges, and the NFL got around to tapping into, you know, that pipeline of players in the 50s and the 60s, and the Steelers, for example, in building their Super Bowl teams. I mean, they were, you know, one of the forerunners. And so that's why when you look at the collection of players that have had such a big impact in the NFL, at least, you know, in that block of time, so many came from HBCUs. And you don't see as many as you would have in that period, because you had integration, and the players who went to HBCU schools in the 50s and 60s, well, they go to places like Alabama now.
Well, it's one of the great shames of our country, certainly, and also then the NFL reflective of the nation, and of course the college football system reflective of the nation. We saw this, and it is kind of unbelievable to think that in our lifetimes that this, of course, was going on. I mean, certainly not unbelievable with life experiences at this table, but thankfully it is a different time. You know, I was honored to cover Doug Williams in that '87 season when Washington won the Super Bowl. And here was a guy who came out of Grambling and went to Tampa Bay, and of course had this great arm. The joke was during the Iranian hostage crisis that if you wanted to send Doug Williams over there because he's the one person who could overthrow the Ayatollah. and then he comes up to Washington, and Joe Gibbs, this is the quarterback battle with Jay Schrader, and Doug wins, and Doug was beloved on the team. And I think in many ways these guys, for me, covering people like Doug and others, in this case we're talking about African American players, who I think were better, dealt with women journalists better. Were much more understanding of women in the locker room.
Why do you think that is?
Because they'd faced discrimination themselves. Different kinds of discrimination.
Sure.
Certainly not comparing the two.
Sure.
But absolutely. I hate to generalize, but people like Doug and other guys, whether they were from historically black schools or not, the African American players were almost to a man better to deal with than the white players. For women, for like going in the locker room for the first time,
Sure.
as I did 1985, when the NFL finally said that there had to be equal access because the Washington Post was putting a woman on the beat, and that happened to be me.
And two of those players are now broadcasters in this space. Shannon Sharpe, who's on Undisputed now and has been there for the last few years, and obviously Michael Strahan, who is now everywhere and synonymous with pop culture as well. Is there something in particular about those schools? Like she said that not only were they easier to deal with the media, but is there something, JB, about being in a space where there's more inclusion of, how do I put this?
Well, you have a comfort zone.
Yeah, that's kind of what I mean.
Let me take it from there, because I think for anybody, any young person, number one, everybody's different. So one person
Sure.
might be able to thrive in a situation where they are really in a minority, and another person really needs the support and the comfort zone and the social network in order to thrive. I think one of the things that happens with, you know, players that come from HBCUs, and you can probably go and say, by extension, you know, students, is that you're able to tap into your potential
Correct.
a lot better, and maybe you feel that the support network that is there is going to help, you know, accentuate your positives and therefore help you grow and develop. And you look at Grambling, for example, and talking about it from a football standpoint with Eddie Robinson and all of the players that he developed that ended up going to the NFL. One of the things that you have to say was a link from these players, or from many of these players, is that they were really prepared to go to the next level in terms of the type of character and the work ethic and kind of the standards that they carried forth. And I think that was something that came through with Grambling. And I know I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but there are all of these factors and these nuances that go into development of people. But if you are able to go to a place where you can just kind of concentrate on being the best that you can and not have to worry about the discrimination and whatnot, I think your chances of being successful, are bolstered, obviously.
My experience with those guys too, players from those schools, is they revered their schools. I mean, I know all guys talk about their alma mater, but this is different. I mean, it's listening to Aeneas Williams, the Cardinals cornerback who's in the Hall of Fame, talking about his experience at Southern University. I mean, it was different than listening to a kid, your average guy from Oklahoma or Alabama. And you get such great stories from those guys who came up. I mean, Aeneas Williams goes to Southern and he's an accounting major for 2 years, doesn't even play football. Walks on to the football team. They barely had a helmet left over to give him. And he's, by mid-season, he's starting and ends up in the Hall of Fame. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there's fewer and fewer of those guys around, but I love to hear those stories. How Aeneas Williams, his first game was against Michael Strahan's school.
Yeah.
That's the first he'd ever heard of Michael Strahan.
Wow. And look at, like you said, Strahan is everywhere now. Someone told me recently, we put Robert Brazile in the Hall of Fame last year, and Kent, like myself, was a member of the selection committee. But someone told me recently that said there'll never be another player from an HBCU school that makes it to the Hall of Fame. And that's a real strong statement, and I don't believe it, by the way, because there are still some guys that we could circle back on, like Everson Walls from Grambling, for example, who may end up being a Hall of Famer, and I would say really should be considered. But I can understand why someone would say that, because there are not as many talented players, or the number of talented players that once had to go to HBCUs. When you start talking about, guys like Buck Buchanan and Willie Lanier, and I'm talking about Hall of Famers, and they ended up having to go, didn't have that option. So now you don't have those players now that would have a generation or two ago would have had to go to HBCUs. Now they have options. But you look at the Colts rookie linebacker last year, Darius Leonard, from an HBCU, and he leads the NFL in tackles and ends up being the Defensive Rookie of the Year. That tells me that there are still players who can still make it from the HBCUs, and if Darius Leonard leads the league in tackles for 10 years, then he'll be a Hall of Famer. So never say never.
You were around Doug Williams a lot, Christine. Mm-hmm. What is his impact when he won the Super Bowl?
Well, it was huge because at that point there had not been a black player to win a Super Bowl, black quarterback to win a Super Bowl. He, of course, got the requisite question, how long have you been a black quarterback, during Super Bowl, during the ridiculous media day, which, the press day, which, of course, has grown to be bigger than life. There was a humility there. I mean, even as he was just this great athlete and great leader, but a humility, and I think it comes born of the fact that you are discriminated against. You were told you were other. You were not part of the group. I mean, Doug Williams today is playing in the SEC, right? But back then, of course not. So he was a team player in every way, and beloved by the team. And again, you cannot stress this back and forth between the starting quarterbacks. At the time, you're not sure Washington, this is the strike year that Washington wins 3 games. The replacement guys do that end up helping them get to the Super Bowl. You have no idea how the story is going to pan out as you're watching it. But little do we know, it becomes this piece of history where he's on the cover of Sports Illustrated as the winning quarterback. And also, by the way, with a knee that was probably the size of, Vermont, because he'd gotten it bent back and was gone for one play and then came back, refused to leave the game.
Do you think that success that he had impacted future generations of men of color focusing on maybe becoming quarterback, setting the vision for what's possible and the success that you can achieve there?
Well, I know for a fact, cheering for the Toledo Rockets, and Chuck Ely, an African-American quarterback, was my hero, and from 69 to 71, the winningest quarterback in college football history, undrafted in the National Football League. And my dad had to tell suburban white girl me, at the age of 13, I was crestfallen that Chuck Ely had not been drafted. And my dad had to explain to me that in the NFL, basically, with very few exceptions to that point, that the NFL did not believe that African-American men were smart enough to play quarterback. And this was horrifying to me. But it was a life lesson, and again, if we use the NFL as this crucible of learning about our culture and society, or a reflection of our society, for me, what could have been a better lesson, as horrifying as it was, that my favorite player, because of the color of his skin, was not going to be drafted in the National Football League. He would have been probably a first or second round pick, scrambling quarterback, very much like a Joe Theismann, but he never ever had that chance. What did he do, by the way, just to finish the story? He goes to Canada. He did not want to play safety or defensive back in the NFL. Chuck Ely goes to Canada and wins the Grey Cup in his first year, and is a very successful businessman to this day.
And so what Doug Williams does in making the statement to win that Super Bowl was, I mean, it dispelled the myth. It really did, that people thought, you know, the thinking was so backward in another time that blacks couldn't play quarterback or couldn't play middle linebacker or couldn't be centers and things like that down the middle of the field.
Anything that required a certain academic.
The intellect. I mean, but it was ridiculous, and it was great that Doug Williams was able to prove that it was ridiculous. Just like it was great that Warren Moon, much like Chuck Ely, has to go to Canada, but at least Warren Moon had the chance to come back to the NFL and just show, you know, how great he was, and lo and behold, he's the first black quarterback to be inducted into the Hall of Fame.
And maybe as much or more to inspire kids to realize what they could do. It helped change the mind of coaches, the people who actually make decisions. It's
of course.
You don't just think, oh, yeah, you're a running back and you're this and you're that. You give them a look, more so maybe than they did in the past.
And now we have one with Kyler Murray, who you're going to be covering. So
who's
been groomed from birth to be an NFL quarterback.
Right, you don't give it a second thought. You know what I mean? And again, it's generational, but to tell younger people who are watching us right now, it was absolutely a shock, and horrifyingly so, but nonetheless, for American society to see an African-American playing quarterback a couple generations ago. Thankfully, that is no longer the case, and now you don't give it a second thought, which is exactly the victory that you're hoping for.